Welcome, everyone, here and at home to the January 13th City Council work session. And the first item we have up this today is one that came to us from our Monday night meeting, and that is an action item on adoption of a resolution regarding system development charges. Assistant City Manager.
Thank you. I was just going to do a quick introduction. I think this is the first time Catherine Brotherton has been at the table. Catherine is our third city attorney that we brought in-house, and so for the people that are watching
Welcome.
from home, this is Catherine. And I'll just turn it over to Mark, and we'll dive into the SDCs.
Okay, so the item was continued from Monday night, and the question was, or the reason it was held over was to get a better sense of the financial impact of deferring the inflationary adjustments on system development charges. So in the memo that was sent to you, we showed a range of, for all four systems on the local side, stormwater, wastewater, parks, and transportation, of the revenue that would be lost if the implementation date was delayed from April 1st to July 1st, and what it would, in the amount that would be lost if it was delayed on to October 1st. And the range is based upon the low end of it is if the development activity is similar to what it was in 2009, which was really kind of the lowest point we incurred during this recession, and then 2008 reflects more of, I guess it'd be the upswing, because 2008 was really so it'd be the reverse of 2008 where things start to pick up. And that's, so for that first 3-month period to be between 80 and 120,000, and then the second would be 160 to 240,000. With the majority, if you look at the four systems, the majority of that would be parks, because they had the greatest increase because of the land component of the vacant land component of the parks SDC.
Thank you for getting that information for us. We appreciate it. And we have a motion on the table, right? So that is before you, and that is on your sheet here. And Mike, I think you're first up to talk about this.
The motion that was tabled was to put off until October. Is that correct?
There's two motions on the table right now, the main motion and then also your motion to amend. So both of those are on the table right now.
My understanding was that where we left this was the motion to amend is the one that was tabled. Do I have that right from a parliamentary standpoint?
Well, it isn't tabled. It was postponed to a date certain, so you don't need to do anything to get it back on the table. Both of those are just on the table
there.
right now.
As you left it.
Right. Okay, thank you. Mark, first of all, do you do any kind of measurement comparative to other jurisdictions of any kind to assess the impact of SDCs on development? In other words, if our rates are higher or lower than in other municipalities, what that impact does to whether or not things get built? Do you do the assessment?
We do a survey of other communities in terms of where Eugene stands for that total financial impact, and we've always been in the kind of in the recent past, we've been in the mid to low mid part of that range in terms of assessing.
Is that regionally or locally?
That's statewide.
Statewide,
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm not aware of anyone that has done any type of analysis as to whether SDCs are the amount of SDCs are a no
Barrier
go.
to...
Go or no go for a development project.
Okay. The other night you gave us some numbers off the top of your head, and certainly nobody's holding you to those because we asked you just to, what do you think? These are significantly different than what we discussed, though. These are based on the comparative level of, of development activity that was evidenced during 2009. Is that what I?
Right. So the low, I think I said tens of thousands. So the low number is based on development activity in 2009. The high number is based upon development activity in 2008.
Okay. I guess the reason I made this motion is because I want to do whatever is possible to do in order to make sure that our local economy recovers adequately, because we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. And if we can do some little bit with at least not an overwhelming impact here, I'd want to do that. I guess the worst of all possible worlds would be were we to put these into play and it did discourage some development, and then the development wouldn't exist, so we wouldn't collect the money anyway. But we would have just simply shot ourselves in the foot. So I'm still in favor of the amendment. So,
Chris?
Thank you. Didn't know it was going to come up so quick. That Alan, is he on?
Yeah, this is Alan.
So
We're just now talking about the SDC delay. We're in that process right now. Mark, do you know if any other jurisdictions have waived their SDCs right now?
The only one I'm familiar with is in Springfield, and they haven't waived them. They've postponed them.
Postponed them, similar to what we've done.
Well, no, I think on their, I believe on the single-family homes, they postpone them until the project is complete. So rather than
So they still
collecting
collect them. It's just the timing for when
Right.
they collect them, but they
Right.
haven't actually put a moratorium on them, so to speak.
That's my understanding.
Okay. This is a significantly different amount of money than what we were pitching around. I know I was making up numbers off the top of my head, so I wouldn't hold them to you either. But, it's a lot of money, and I'm in a quandary because I don't know how many projects this might result in a delay for. I don't know if any projects would be delayed or not. But I do know that this is a significant amount of money, even if we were to go for a shortened timeline. So I'd like to hear what the other folks have to say, but it definitely is a difficult choice. It's an amount of money you're estimating we would lose versus the potential for something being built or not being built. SDCs in Springfield are still in effect. They're just collecting them at a different time.
Right, and I believe that's just for residential.
Just for residential. So they're doing their regular SDC process for commercial and industrial.
That's my understanding.
And you're not aware of any other jurisdictions that have done anything with their SDCs to either delay, postpone, or...
No, I'll see if Nancy's aware of any, but I'm not.
No, actually, back to Springfield.
Please identify yourself, too.
I'm Nancy Burns of Public Works Engineering.
It's on.
Okay, thank you. And regarding Springfield, it's my understanding that, Mark is correct as far as the deferring payment for residential. That's only if the developer was inclined to do so. It's my understanding that not many opted for that option, but it is available. And they adopted some local increases to their rates this last year and deferred implementation in various stages, and it's for this fall. It's my understanding that they are now in full effect.
In full effect?
That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay.
And just as a comparison, because that is a recent comparison that I've done, just pulling information from their website, that in comparison to what we're proposing for the April increase, their existing rates for an SFD, single-family development, would be approximately 27% higher than what we're proposing.
Okay.
That's a local example right there.
Okay, that's good. It's always nice to know what the other jurisdictions are doing. It's a tough one. My sympathies go out to developers who are paying a lot of money to try to put something together, but in this case, I think the revenue potential loss, the fact that other jurisdictions really aren't doing the same kind of thing, so it's not like we're somehow out of sync with other cities. I think I probably would go ahead and support the increase at this point. Not enthusiastically, but I do think I would go ahead and support it, yeah.
I've got George Brown and George Poling and Andrea in the queue, and I guess the only comment I would make at this point is for us, that just has to be a tension between our budgetary challenges, and so what we're trying to do to make up for what we don't have, and at the same time considering bringing less in, and and we're trying to do that with some thought to helping the businesses that are here in our community. And I think I have to sympathize with that, but I think we have to put some kind of proportion around that about what effect do you have on business in your community if you can't do the other things that need to be done in the community to make it a good place for a business to succeed in. So that kind of seems to me like we have to put those kind of balances together and come up with what we think really overall can serve business and the general community the best. George Brown.
Thank you.
Mayor, can I be in the queue, too?
Well, I have a question, I suppose, for Mark, and actually for all the counselors, my fellow counselors and mayor, too, is nobody has come up to me and said, this is going to be a deal breaker. I do know some smaller builders, and I don't know any big guys, but I know people that do single-family residences. No one has called me or come up. I haven't seen any emails. I don't recall any testimony at any of our recent public hearings of somebody saying, this is just going to absolutely stop my project if this happens. I haven't heard that from builders, and I'm just wondering if anybody has. Has anyone heard protests? I haven't. And my wife and I are actually, we have a project planned for our store, and this will affect the cost, but I've figured that we can handle them, that they're pretty modest increases, and they're definitely will not be a deal breaker for us. So I'm inclined to support the original increases rather than delaying the amendment delaying the implementation. Thank you.
George Polling?
In the past, Mark, whenever we've had a topic covering SDCs, we've always had a comparison chart. I think this is the first one in the 7 years I've been on the council that we've gotten an SDC AIS without the comparison chart. So next time, can you just kind of throw that in, just so we can kind of see where we're going to be in the long run. And I was going to ask you the same thing, basically, that George did, is have we gotten any feedback from any of the developers, any of the home builders, or anything as far as the actual increase itself and delaying or not delaying the increase? Have you received any?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, yeah, neither have I. So I'm a little concerned about, like the mayor was saying, do we delay this for the sake of maybe having projects go forward? Do we not delay it so we can, whatever projects do go forward, we do collect the money? The thing is, the ultimate increase is going to be paid by the consumer, the first-time home buyer, the George Browns in our community that want to expand their business. It's not going to affect the developers. It's going to be their clients that are going to end up paying for it in the long run. And my other concern about delaying it is if we delay it out until October, that gives us 6 months under the new rates when we have to look at the inflationary increase again. What's that going to look like then? I mean, if we look at another 20% increase, I could just hear the backlash now. Well, you just increased it 20-some-odd% 6 months ago, and you're hitting us up again. So, it's one of those. This is one of those cases where it's a tough one. It's a tough one, but I think in the long run, I think we're better off not delaying it. I mean, we've delayed it once. I just think in order to recover the cost now, I think it would be better to go ahead and start the increase. So I don't know if I can really support the amendment at this point.
Andrea?
I think kind of my concerns have been articulated by the other counselors.
Okay. Alan? Alan?
He's gone.
Yeah, I had to take it off mute. Sorry.
It does that easy all the time. No,
I can hear surprisingly well, by the way.
Sorry, Alan.
I didn't get the benefit of having seen Mark's memo. Can someone just recap it for me real quick, what it says in terms of dollars?
Want to do that, Mark?
80 to 120.
So we looked at the revenue that was brought in 2009 and in 2008, and created a range. So for 3 months, 2008 was kind of the decline into the recession, and 2009 was kind of at full force. So at the low end for a 3-month delay, it would be 80,000. At the high end for that 3 months, it'd be 120, and then for the 6 months, those numbers would double too. So the range would be 160 to 240,000. So that's for the 4 local systems, with the majority of that money impacting the parks system development charge.
Yeah, okay. That's substantially more than I thought it was going to be. I'm in concurrence with the folks that said they're not inclined to support the amendment. I'm done.
Okay. Mike, you have something you want to say here?
Yeah, I just wanted to say first that to answer your question, George, I have contact with a lot of builders and with a lot of members of the home builders and that sort of thing, and they've had a substantial loss in membership over the course of the last year, which may account for why some of them haven't called us, because they're not in that business anymore. And for me, this is about kind of reflecting. I made the motion because I hear from a lot of them that say, hey, do anything that you can do. And we saw an unfortunate comment in the RG the other day about our willingness to work with people, and what I wanted to do was make sure that we were doing everything we could do to remove barriers, as Betty has said, and to make sure that we weren't standing in the way. But certainly I hear everybody, and frankly, based on what Nancy said, I'm happy that we're not outside the range of a comparative problem, and I'd be willing to withdraw the motion. But I would have one question, that is, you mentioned that some builders in Springfield had mentioned that, or they had not taken advantage of the deferral in actual payment. Was there a reason for that? What was the reason that they...
If memory serves me, the reason why that was is because they were still having a lien on their property, even though they were getting deferred. They didn't want the idea of having a lien on the property during that time period. So that's why it kind of defeated their purpose.
Okay. Because I was going to suggest maybe we consider a collection issue similar, but that doesn't sound like it's a wise idea. So on that, I withdraw the motion entirely.
And the second
Isn't here. Was Jennifer, wasn't it?
No, she's not here. Okay, so it's withdrawn,
It is.
and we're back to the main motion.
Second.
Do you need it restated?
I don't think we need it restated. We'll just, everybody's got it in front of them. Alan, do you need the main motion restated for you?
No, I don't. It takes effect in April 1st, right? An appropriate day.
Did you want to say something?
I don't, I'm just asking whether or not the
Oh, the
second
technical?
person that seconded the motion has to agree. Withdraw.
Does she?
Yeah, I mean, generally, you have to withdraw the motion and have the second withdrawn.
Assuming they're at the meeting.
So should we go ahead and vote on it?
You know, and I've never been in this situation where the second's not there. It would probably be cleaner just to vote on it.
Okay.
Just to vote on the motion.
As amended.
So we'll vote on the
No, the
amendment.
amendment.
We'll vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment indicates it. No one is voting in favor of the amendment.
I thought the conversation was good.
So it goes down. Now we're back to the main motion. Would you please vote on the main motion? 6 in favor here. How about you, Alan?
Yes.
Okay, 7 in favor and none in opposition. It passes. Cleanly done. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Okay. Next item up is our work session item on the federal priority projects list.
Thank you, Mayor. I was going to hand it over to our Brenda Wilson.
Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council. For the record, Brenda Wilson, Intergovernmental Relations Manager. It's that time again. It seems to come faster and faster, doesn't it? So today, we're bringing an action item before you for our federal priorities list for fiscal year 2011 for the federal appropriations cycle. And so what I'd like to do, if it's all right with you, is to discuss very briefly how the federal appropriations process works, and then go over what our United Front process is, and then move right into the projects that have been recommended to you by the IGR. So the federal appropriations process, I'm going to make it a lot more simple than it actually is. But basically, every year, Congress gets together and based on a recommended budget by the President, hammers out how they're going to spend their money. And they do this primarily by allocating money to one of 12 appropriations bills, buckets, as I call them. And each one of these buckets contains numerous programs that fund various federal, state, and local programs, and also provides funding for a wide variety of projects, either projects that are designated by law or those projects where members of Congress would like to congressionally direct that funding. We know that more commonly as earmarks. So there are 12 bills that Congress reviews and determines how much money they want to put into these bills. And depending on whether or not they make it through their process, sometimes these bills are consolidated into omnibus bills, and in the past couple of years, we have seen that. And they do this every single year. So we are approaching that time again. That moves us into our United Front process. We, along with 6 other partners in our region, have decided that it is more beneficial and effective for us to partner and to go to our congressional fellow delegation with one voice, one united voice. And we've been doing this for over 20 years, and it has been very successful for us. And recently, this past fall, we lost one of our partners. That partner is Cottage Grove. They did not believe that they could continue to participate in the United Front for financial reasons, and we know that we're all looking at that, which is why I'd like to explain to you why the United Front is important for the city of Eugene. The United Front partnership over the last 20 years has brought in hundreds of millions of dollars to our region that may not have come into our region without this effort. Each year, the United Front process starts before the last year's ends, and we develop a list of projects that we believe fit into one of the 12 appropriation buckets. And we discuss that on a wide variety of levels, both with our regional partners, with staff, with our elected officials, and we come up with a recommended list. We then take that recommended list and we look for appropriate funding mechanisms. If there is not an appropriate funding mechanism in one of those 12 bills, we can't ask for congressionally directed spending earmark because there is no way to get us that money. So whereas the list of projects that the IGR committee is recommending this year, or in any year, contains priorities for our community and for our region, that doesn't mean that those are the only priority projects in our city that lack funding. It simply means that in many cases there is nowhere to request the money from. And we help our delegation by identifying those funding sources before we ask for the money. So that's how we develop this year's list. We develop the list, we bring it through the IGR committee for discussion and support, and that recommendation then comes to you for action. At which point, once the City Council approves the recommended list, we then combine that list with lists from our other United Front partners to come up with our United Front priority list. And there are some rules that go around that list, and the primary one is that we do not compete for money out of the same bucket, because the underlying reason that we do this process to begin with is to help our delegation help us. And if we've made those decisions on the regional level, it makes it a lot easier for them to help us locate and obtain funding that we would not be able to do otherwise. Just to put this into some perspective, federal earmarks, which our congressional delegation would prefer that we called them congressionally delegated spending, but and I will try to help them out with that. But for right now, for this discussion, earmarks are going down. As you know, there have been some issues and some discretion with earmarks in the recent years. Earmarks are down 6% from what they were in 2006 for fiscal year 2006. So what was prepared in 2005? That there are a number of reasons for that. It isn't because there aren't good projects out there, but there's more scrutiny on those projects. And beginning last year, our congressional delegation began publishing the projects that they were pushing on their websites for the public to see. Last year, our senators received 529 requests statewide for federal congressionally directed spending. Only 77 of those requests were funded. Funds are being are very difficult to obtain. The United Front was able to obtain 3 federally congressionally directed funding earmarks off of our fiscal year 2010 list, funding that is very scarce, and we're very glad to have. One of the reasons that I believe that it's so successful, and Councilor Poling wanted me to discuss this very briefly with you, is the part of the process that occurs after we develop our federal priorities list. Once we do that, we fill out appropriations lists for each one of our congressional delegation. Those lists are sort of like request forms, sort of very detailed, and we also include information not only about which funding mechanism we believe this best fits in, and sometimes we're not correct, and we worked with staff to determine which bucket is correct, but the number of jobs that will be created, the amount of local support and match that we have, and that list is then presented to our congressional delegation and their staff. But it doesn't end there. As you know, we prepare a booklet to be presented to not only our congressional delegation and their staff, but to appropriations staff, to agency staff. And the reason we do that is because it's not enough just for us to submit a form. There isn't a window where all of these forms are submitted through and then somebody decides. It is not a moment in time effort. It is a year-long effort, and in many, many cases it is a year after year after year effort for these appropriations requests. We're asking our congressional delegation to do a big lift for us. In many of these cases, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars. And so one of the things I think that makes us most successful is that in the spring of every year, very shortly after, less than 10 days after our appropriations forms are sent in, we make a trip with our United Front partners back to D.C. Traditionally, historically, it has always been the highest elected official from each partner, and in our case, that would be Mayor Piercy, and staff for support. In the last couple of years, that has been myself, because I have the most information about these projects and the appropriations requests. And any other staff that's been necessary, especially where it's a very highly technical, intricate project, as many of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers projects are, and some other elected officials in the past, along with the city manager. The benefits, I can't even begin to explain the benefits that this is. It's not about just asking our congressional delegation to submit an earmark request into a bill. For many projects, especially water projects with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has to sign off on those projects as well. Our congressional delegation cannot submit an earmark request without that sign off. And in some of the other cases, appropriation staff that are not in any way associated with our congressional staff make these decisions, and they make these decisions after consulting with federal agency staff. The purpose of our trip back to D.C. is to provide the necessary information to those people who are going to be helping make the decision about whether or not an earmark goes into one of the 12 bills, and they've received that information from us. And as this is an ongoing process, once we've made that personal face-to-face connection, it makes it easier for federal agency staff and congressional staff to pick up the phone and give us a call, ask us for additional information. And I can think of two specific instances where that has been very important, and I think resulted in the city of Eugene receiving funding that we may not have received. The most recent being the ERA funding, the stimulus funding that came out of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for Delta Ponds, for the restoration work out there that had been on our United Front federal priorities list for a number of years, and then suddenly the stimulus funds became available. We have developed a very close working relationship with the federal main office out in D.C., and when we were there last year, we discovered that the chief engineer was going to be making a trip out into our area, and we immediately jumped on that and invited her down to walk the projects. She did. She was very impressed with Delta Ponds project and Springfield Mill Race, and less than 2 weeks later, when the ERA funding report came out for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers priority projects, both Springfield Mill Race and Delta Ponds were on that list, and as you know, we recently signed the contract to begin that work, and I'm not positive that that would have happened had we not had that close working relationship with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Federal Office. And there are several other examples of that as well. And so I my recommendation would be that we continue making that trip. That even in these tight times, that is an expense, but the return on investment is huge. The relationships that we develop and the information that we provide and continue to provide on a year-long basis to federal agency staff and congressional staff are important for us to assist our congressional delegation in bringing this money back to our community. So with that overview, I'd like to talk to you about the projects that are being recommended, and I have one addition that came in late last week after you received this. I've divided up the recommendation for the projects into three separate lists, if you will. The first is updates and programmatic requests. The second are appropriation requests for fiscal year 2011. And those will be earmarks that we are requesting out of this upcoming round of federal appropriations, and then the reauthorization requests. This year, we hope, we had hoped last year when the federal transportation reauthorization bill was supposed to be renewed, but was delayed and is still being delayed, that we would get some funding out of that. It didn't happen last year. It's in continuing resolution, but we're hopeful that it will happen this year. Basically, what that means is that instead of 12 buckets of money this year, there are 13 buckets of money because there's this additional transportation funding bucket that is huge. It only comes around once every 6 years, and that's why I've divided this out. So for updates and programmatic requests, basically what that usually is for the United Front is information that we provide to our congressional delegation and their staff to let them know what has happened with the money that they have already helped us receive, or what is happening with projects that we either can't request a full appropriation at the time, and it's also a place for us and an opportunity for us to request policy input, which is not something the United Front normally does. This is really about money, but in some cases it's appropriate for us to take that opportunity. So the recommendations for this upcoming federal priority round will be that we will give our congressional delegation an update on the Delta Ponds project. Like I said, we received over $1.6 million in ARRA funding that allowed us to sign contracts at the beginning of December to move that project forward. We had a press conference. It's very exciting for our community. And I'll leave Metro Waterways till last. FAA reauthorization. This is for all federal air bills that are out there, either requesting maximum funding for particular programs, or in the case of airlines and airway money, certain policy recommendations. Now, Tim Dahl, the airport manager, does this separately from the United Front, but we also like to back him up on this, so we include it as part of our United Front effort. And of course, you all know about the Medicare ambulance relief. That is a policy issue that we have been pushing for the last 18 months on our congressional delegation to support the numerous bills that are going through Congress that would extend that ambulance relief either for a longer period of time, or we're hoping permanently. And so we intend to push that as the United Front this year, and I know that came out of the joint elected officials meeting as well. Metro Waterways, we have had this on our list for a number of years, as I'm sure you know. We have been in the programmatic and environmental assessment phase of that. The last remaining $134,000 went into that project, was appropriated to that project last year out of stimulus funding. The issue is that exceeded the cap that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers allows for any particular project. So they had this money, they weren't sure what to do with it, but the phase was only approximately 80% complete. And how this core project is working is we cannot move into the next phase until the previous phase is completed, which makes sense. Which means we can't ask for money for the next phase until we can assure the Army Corps of Engineers and our congressional delegation that the previous phase is completed. We're this close to completing phase one. The $134,000, we just learned just recently in the last week that they have found a way to obligate that money to this project so they can assure Congress they will spend it, which would allow us to move to the second phase. The second phase would be for pre-construction, engineering, and design. we would request two parts, two amounts from the same bucket of money, totaling $1 million. The City of Eugene would request $500,000 for Amazon Creek for pre-construction engineering and design, and the City of Springfield, who is our partner on this project, would also request $500,000 for work to be done on Cedar Creek. Right now, I have it listed under updates and programmatic requests because we have not received firm confirmation from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that they are ready to move into the second phase. And we really can't ask for federal appropriations money for a project that's not ready to go. We can't do that to our congressional staff, and especially with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers projects, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has to sign off. Without their sign-off, we won't be able to request this funding. That only means that this project is on hold until they can get to the point where they're ready to move on, which could mean that we will bring this back to you for fiscal year 2012 appropriation cycle. I wanted you to know that staff is working very hard to get that confirmation from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and if we can get that before the appropriations requests are due at the end of February, we'd like to move this into Phase 2 and request that $1 million. So that'll be something that I'll be asking you today as well. On to the appropriations requests, if there are no questions about updates and...
Well, I have questions, and I just want
to wait till you get...
we can wait till we're done? Sure, that might make it easier. All right. So for appropriations requests, the first is Forest Legacy. It's our current project. It's a request for $1.915 million. And how this process works is that every year, anyone who has a Forest Legacy project submits that to the state forestry office. The state then submits it to the regional office. A list is compiled by the regional office and sent to Washington, D.C., where a final list for Forest Legacy eligible projects is compiled. That list usually consists of between 45 and 50 projects nationwide. And every year, the list is done over. So if your project is not funded in 1 year, it's not like they remove the projects that were funded from the list and you move up on the list. The list is completely thrown out and started over. That list is, there's no really rhyme or reason to the list. It's not like the cheapest projects are at the top of the list or the most acres for the monies at the top of the list. Those lists are made based on recommendations from state and regional offices. This year, our project was number 32 on the list. We requested the funding we submitted our appropriations request. Both our senators and Mr. DeFazio submitted that request. But over the last couple of years, I've noticed an issue with Forest Legacy. Basically, it is an accounting game, so to speak. Congress appropriates X amount of money to the Forest Legacy program. They take the list, they start subtracting off the top of the list, and when the money runs out, that's it. And in the last 2 years, the money ran out before it got to our project. As you know, the first phase of our Forest Legacy property up on the ridgeline was funded, and that was funded because we happened to be in an office in D.C. and notice when they were explaining to us that our project wasn't going to be funded, that there were 2 projects on the list above ours that were crossed out with pen. And I just happened to notice that and asked about it, and they said, well, those projects can't go through now, and did some quick math in my head and noticed it was exactly, almost to the dollar, the amount of money that would be needed to fund the next 2 projects on the list, ours being the second project. So we immediately got on the phone with Mr. DeFazio's office and requested that he request carryover funds. That's how our first Forest Legacy project got funded. Another important example of why it's important for us to be there and be meeting. So what happened this year is, again, they appropriated X amount of dollars, they did the math, and it didn't make our project. This time it missed our project by 6. I'm happy to say, though, however, another project in the state of Oregon was funded, and as you know, we have a long history of Forest Legacy not being allowed in the state of Oregon. So I am asking we will do this a little bit differently this year. We'll go ahead and ask for the appropriations request, but what we're really going to ask our delegation, and will require some additional work because we won't know until the end, we'll ask for the entire program to be funded at a level, so when the accounting is done, it covers our project. So instead of you may see there will be a request, instead of asking for the $1.9 million, we'll be asking for somewhere in the neighborhood of $80 million. But we're not asking for that to fund projects that we have. We're asking the entire program to be funded at that level to make sure when they do the math, it covers our project. I think that's a better way to do it. The West Eugene Transportation Implementation request is a current project that will look at environmental documentation and complete preliminary design for the belt line from Roosevelt to West 11th and West 11th from Terry to Green Hill, and also look at some of the other recommendations that are coming out for that particular area. So that's an ongoing requests that we already have. A new request is special operations facilities, the energy efficiency and seismic upgrades. This is a new project. Right now, special operations has been retrofitted into a very old building. That building is not energy efficient, and it does not meet seismic standards. This request would be to upgrade that facility, not build a new one, but to retrofit it for energy efficiency items and also increase seismic, upgrade it so that it meets seismic standards. That request would be a $1 million request. The next new project would be fire hydrant replacements. As you may or may not know, currently our fire hydrant system in the city is very old. Approximately 31% of the hydrants are over 50 years old, and another 24% between 40 and 50 years old. The life expectancy of a fire hydrant is between 50 and 60 years, so they're old. And as you can imagine, many of these fire hydrants that are reaching the end of their life cycle are in low-income areas. Prior to 1985, EWEB owned all of the hydrants and was responsible for the upkeep and the maintenance. But in 1985, we entered into an agreement with EWEB to take over the ownership of those fire hydrants. The replacement, as with other things, has fallen behind, and we have a very limited budget. And right now, to replace a single fire hydrant, it costs $5,000, $1,500 for the actual equipment, and the other $3,500 for staff and installation and hookup to the water main. EWEB has been in discussion with staff and entered into an MOU just last year on the relative responsibilities for the fire hydrants, and they have agreed to take over the 70% cost of installing a fire hydrant. If we just come up with the fire hydrant, they will take over the rest of it. They've also indicated that if we can show that we are willing to do this, they would be willing to take over the entire $10 million backlog. For our cost of $250,000. This I can't, I know I don't even need to tell you what sort of a leverage $250,000 against a $10 million backlog is. But we believe we've identified a bucket of money on the federal level. We believe this is a good project. It meets many community needs, and it's a good story. And so we would like to move this forward. If we can get the $250,000 from the federal government, there is a very good chance we can have EWEB take over the rest of the backlog, which would be excellent. The next new project is the MWMC electrical generator upgrade. Right now, we have excess digester gas that is not being used to either produce energy or it's being wasted, basically. It's being burnt off, which also causes other issues, such as greenhouse gas emissions. MWMC had a study done to look at alternatives for addressing this and several other issues out there, and they determined that the least cost method would be to upgrade the generators. This would be a cost of $6 million. It would be a joint project with Eugene and Lane County, since they are MWMC partners. Would upgrade the generators out there to expand capacity so that we could take care of that excess digester gas, which we expect to only increase over time. So then on to the reauthorization request. And the reason that this is separate is because we have already gone through this process. We did this last December of 2007, where we developed a reauthorization list, and those were transportation projects that we would request out of the renewal of safety, Lou, basically. As I just stated, and as you know, that bill was not reauthorized, but it was put on continuing, sort of a continuing resolution until they can find funding for it. Out of the list that we submitted to Mr. DeFazio, these are the projects that he chose to move forward. So the Franklin Boulevard Multi-Way project, which would be an environmental analysis project for the city of Eugene, our request would be $22.5 million for design, construction, and environmental analysis. The second would be Beltline Road and Corridor Study, which is a current project that has also been on our appropriations request. This would be to address safety and congestion issues on the Beltline Road and Coburg Road area, which is part of an ODOT project, a huge ODOT project, as you know, that has been going on. And our request would be $18 million for NEPA and preliminary and design. And the third request would be West Bank Path and Pathway lighting. This West Bank Path connector, as you know, it's about 3,200 feet that needs to be installed to connect part of the riverfront bike path system where it goes off the path and bike riders find themselves having to navigate in traffic. This has been a United Front project for several years. We tried different funding mechanisms. We couldn't find them. We decided to discuss it with Mr. DeFazio's staff. They agreed that it would make an excellent reauthorization project, which is evidenced by the fact that this is one of the projects Mr. DeFazio chose. But since this is such a huge, huge bucket of money, we decided to add pathway lighting to the project and increase our request from approximately $1.5 million to $4 million. Because there's much more money available out of this bucket. The addition that I had for you is the request for $750,000 to expand teen courts in Lane County. That is a project that the city of Eugene participates in. Right now, the existing teen courts only cover southwest and west Eugene, and basically what it does is it takes in juvenile offenders who have committed minor offenses, trespass, small misdemeanors, drug possession, puts them into courts and gives them some mentoring and some other options. The recidivism rate out of these juvenile offenders is very, very small. The city of Eugene has recognized benefits from it and actually proposed this project, but because these are run out of Lane County, we suggested and we requested from Lane County that they include this on their list. They like the idea so much, they contacted the city of Springfield, asked if they would like to be involved, and the request has gone from $350,000 to $750,000, and they've asked that we partner on this project request with them. So that would be the other addition that's not included on your sheet. So those are the recommended projects for fiscal year 2011 along with the reauthorization bill. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. That was a great explanation and a lot of stuff to cover. So
Yes.
thank you very much. I guess before I call on people who are lined up here, I'd like to say I think we'd all like to express, and this is our vehicle for expressing it, our appreciation to our delegation for working with us on and on and on to try to make things happen at home, even in these very difficult times. I think it's important, and you brought it up, Brenda, I think it's important for the public to know that this isn't like one big pile of money that's sitting in some place and we could just pick and choose and do whatever we want. It is already designated as within categories, and we are looking for what we can get within those categories. And that seems to be, we hear that over and over again, that people have difficulty understanding that. So I think it bears repeating that we're really trying to advantage dollars that are already in those buckets and try to find places that can help our communities and our region move forward, especially economically. So, the other thing I would like to point out, and I think it's pretty obvious, but people, again, it's an education thing. It sometimes takes you going back after the same project year after year after year before you actually see it all the way through. It takes persistence to see these things through. You very frequently don't get them the first time you go and ask for them, but they do seem to, with continuous effort, we seem to be able to eventually bring them in with the help of our delegation. So that's why you have to keep these relationships going and this effort moving time after time. We have an IGR committee that works on these issues, and I want to give Betty here as chair of our IGR committee. I don't know if she has anything that she wants to add to this discussion or not.
I think Brenda's covered it very well. Thanks.
All right, and Andrea serves on it, and George. Andrea?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think that it was very well articulated, and I appreciate the way that you shared how it's a group effort amongst our partners in Lane County. I think that that's really important to share with the community, that we don't work on these things alone, because so much of our stuff is interconnected. And when I talked about this last night about a different issue, somebody described it as a nervous system. And I really kind of like that analogy, because we are really connected, and the health of and the well-being of our community is really what is the overarching goal of all this. And so I think you did a very good job. Thanks.
I think your point is well taken, because sometimes we hear things in the press about not working well with each other, but I think we've demonstrated for 20 years that we consistently go after and work together on behalf of our larger region. George, did you have something you wanted to
Well, I've
add
got
to
some questions and comments, but if
And then you're next.
If I might.
He's on IGR.
These are more directed, some of the questions are directed at actually the process. First of all, we'll just get this out of the way. Just a ballpark figure, approximately what did it cost the city to do the United Front, make the United Front trip? But that's including, if you have that figure, including printing up the packet.
Last year, so that's what we're going off of, it cost $4,050 for the printing up of the packet. We have to ship approximately 150 of these books out to D.C. We divide them among the partners. Where there is a very small reception that we hold for Mr. DeFazio and his staff. That's included in the $4,050. That also includes my travel expenses. So $4,050 a year to make the trip to D.C. We just received word 3 weeks ago that our 150 that we will be receiving $150,000 for our simulator training center, which will be the beginning of what will be a regional training center. This will be an ongoing request that we will continue to expand. And that's been on the list for 2 years. And so it took us 2 years to get that $150,000.
So the financial investment that the city makes for this United Front trip is very minimal compared to what we're getting back, basically. The other question is on this project list, how do we get this? We, the council, how does it come to us? Is it worked up by the executive managers, or just a real brief synopsis on how that list comes about, if you can?
Sure, Mayor Piercy, Councilor Poling. We've developed the list in several different ways over the last couple of years. I am trying to find a way to get more comprehensive input. This year, going to the executive managers, they suggested that we look at the CIP list. Those are projects that have already been identified, prioritized, and approved in many cases for moving forward if only we had funding. So we looked at those, and we tried to match those up with one of the 12 buckets of money that were available. That's where some of these additional projects come from. They come from staff. They can come from elected officials. In the case of the fire hydrant, that was just a need that I identified out of a conversation that I had with eWeb, and identified it as a good opportunity for us. So it comes from that. The list begins much, much larger than this. Once we can match those up to one of the 12 funding mechanisms and we then have to narrow down the list because of the limitation of the funds. It would be really great if there was just one bucket and we could just apply for that money, but it isn't. Most of this money is very specific and limited. For instance, we can buy maybe police radios, but we can't use that same funding to fund a position. And so that's where this list comes from.
Yeah, when you were talking about the teen courts, you said that it covered Southwest and West Eugene. Was that actually Lane County that you meant instead of Eugene?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Bowling, no, Eugene uses those two courts. The teen court system used to be very broad and used to include courts in Springfield, which they've had to eliminate because of funding. This is one of those buckets of money that actually funds operations of programs. In Eugene and in Lane County, it's really been narrowed down to just those two areas where they're run out of schools, and just really service those students, and they're almost all students because they're juvenile offenders in those two areas. But as I stated before, the City of Eugene staff sees a huge benefit for having teen courts, and Lane County would like to extend that further through the region.
And then on the Delta Ponds, you said that $1.6 million had been received. The notation here says this project was funded out of the ARA funds, and contracts were signed last week, yet we're requesting 3.8. Is that an additional 3.8, or the 3.8 million, does that include the 1.6 that we've received?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Pauling, the 1.6 is part of the original 3.8 that we had requested. It's in there for update. We'd like to explain to our congressional delegation how our request broke down and how we'll move the project forward. There will be no request for Delta Ponds this year. It's fully funded, and like you just stated, the contracts were signed, and we expect that project to finally move forward.
Okay, and then the last thing was on the West Bank path and pathway lighting. That's been bumped up from 1.7 million to 4.05 million to include lighting and other improvements. Monday night at our public forum, a gentleman from the Sustainability Commission came in with some recommendations or a wish list. Would any of those recommendations or items from the wish list, would they be able to qualify and possibly be added to this this portion of the United Front's efforts? Or are you even aware of what those recommendations were?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Pauling, I'm not aware of those recommendations. I could talk to transportation staff to see if we could include that, but this particular request has already been submitted, and it's already been chosen by Mr. DeFazio to move on. But that doesn't mean that some of those projects aren't going to be ready for an appropriations request for the 2012 appropriation cycle, and we're always looking for projects. This, although there's been talk of eliminating earmarks, I don't see that happening, and certainly there are many congressional members that believe that that's why they go to Congress, to bring money home for their constituents.
Well, I would kind of like maybe leave that as a placeholder for our next go-around, because we are going to be having a discussion about STIPU funds here shortly, and there's been a couple of emails back and forth about that, and we need as many dollars as we can to put into preservation of what we already have in place. And I understand the goal is to try to reduce vehicle miles and get more people on mass transit and on bicycles. But we already have this elaborate transportation system with infrastructure in place, and I think we need to invest every little penny that we can find into keeping that usable. And if there's other possible funding sources for the bike paths and the bike lanes and that type of thing, I think we should go after that also. Thank you.
I appreciate that, George. The thing that we heard from our Sustainability Commission, what he's referring to, was a real ask for us to do what we can to enhance our bike system and transit system. And
Pedestrian.
And pedestrian. And I think those are all on our list, and maybe what we're looking for is to be sure in one way or another that we hit those things. What funds we choose to allocate for those different things is a different question than are we moving all those different things along in one way or another within the way we go after funding.
Good suggestion.
Mike, you're next.
Thank you. First of all, I agree with George about maintenance of current infrastructure as a priority. I agree entirely. Number two, thank you very much for the hard work, and to IGR as well for putting this together and doing such a good job year after year of making sure that we're doing this in an intelligent way. I've got a list of questions and may need another round. First of all, how come, is SRS a part of earmarks at all, ever? Has it been in the past? Could it be? Is it at the county level?
SRS.
Secure Rural Schools?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, yes, it is. And there will be a request. I don't know what the request will be asking for, but the Lane County is putting that together either for a new renewal or an alternative to SRS, given that the extension that they received last time was very small and it went down over time. So, yes, that is going to be part of Lane County's request.
But we're not making that request because it's not within our jurisdiction?
Well, it's not, Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, it's not that we don't make that request. It's not a funding request. It is a policy request. It will be part of the United Front agenda, and being that we are partners, we will be behind that request as well.
Maybe I need to ask a better question. Why is it that we're not, for example, we know that when SRS, as it's currently put forward, when it goes away in 2-3 years here, that's a loss of somewhere, the estimate is between $15 and $20 million. To the county, which means the jail pretty much goes away. And I'd say that's going to affect folks in Eugene. I consider it one of the most pressing problems we have in the county. Is it being asked as a specific earmark, or they're pursuing it based on other policies to be funded through a different means?
Yeah, Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, it can't be an earmark.
That's what I was asking. Okay.
Right. It is the request to extend entire program, which is a policy request.
Okay. Secondly, you mentioned the Beltline corridors on the last section here, and $18 million for the NEPA and preliminary designs. That seems a lot. Is that the full content of what's going to happen with that next phase?
It's my understanding from staff that it's a $50 million project. The city of Eugene is requesting $18 million for our portion.
Just for the NEPA and the preliminary design, but not actually building it and not actually. That's awful lot of money just for that. That's an interesting piece of information.
Yes, Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, is a very, very large bucket of money.
Andrea and I both serve on the steering committee for that project at its current phase in the corridor study. Is there any way to move that along any faster that you're aware of through this normal process, other than what's outlined here? And secondarily, does Congressman DeFazio have any input? Well, I'm sure he does, but what's his relative input on the relative priority of these projects once they get through that level?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, to answer your first question, because the bucket of money that we've identified for this is the reauthorization bucket of money, and it has already expired and Congress continued it, there isn't really any way to push that process faster along. The only other way to make it faster would be for us to request it out of the regular appropriations process. But talking with Mr. DeFazio and his staff, he doesn't recommend that. He doesn't believe that that will be successful. To answer your second question, he has a lot of input because Mr. DeFazio and his staff, a particular staff member who I've got to know very, very well by meeting with her on a personal basis, is actually writing the bill. This is one of those bills that is different than normal appropriations bills in that it will come out with a list of projects. I think it's a very good sign that Mr. DeFazio has already chosen this as one of the projects, and so to answer your question about whether or not he's prioritized it, he already has by choosing it.
I actually meant relative to those other projects on this list, because we've identified that project as the highest transportation priority in this area.
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, yes, because it's a separate bucket of money. And so when we prioritize these projects that will go through reauthorization, that's a separate priority from our regular appropriations. In other words, it will not compete with the rest of these transportation projects that are on the list for appropriation.
And that's going to be whenever the feds decide to put that one back. And it may be sooner than next year, but they're not sure, isn't that? Yeah, okay. What's the Forest Legacy project that's you mentioned? You talked about the last one considerably there, and congratulations. What's the specifics of this year's ask?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, the Forest Legacy Project is, the program itself is for purchase of property that is of high environmental quality to be brought into a particular area. We've developed a plan, it's part of our Ridgeline plan, and we've already started the process. This would be for the purchase of 2 pieces of property. This particular property is of such high environmental value that its cost per acre tends to be much higher than the other pieces of the other projects that are being submitted by the state of Oregon. We do know as of...
when is it? Where is it?
The other one is in eastern Oregon. There are 3 this year, actually. There were 2 last year. One was funded. That was right outside of Bend. That project was funded. There were 3 submitted this year. We're already in the middle of this process. They were ranked by a special committee that's called on a statewide basis. That committee gave 2 rankings. They ranked one project as number 2, and they tied our project with the other project for number 1. The region said you can't do that, reprioritize them, and we came in second. So we're listed second out of 3 projects that were submitted to the regional office this year. Like I said before, those will go to the federal office, and they'll be prioritized and ranked depending on however many other projects came in.
Where is our project located geographically? Where is that land?
I have a really great map so that you can see it. It's probably easier, but it's up on the ridge line. This red mark right here is the piece of property that was the first purchase.
Green property, as we would call
Right.
it. Probably, right?
There are 2 additional properties here. These are the proposed Forest Legacy sites for this request, the 1.9 million. They will they will connect up the Ridgeline Trail in 2 separate areas, this down here and this up here.
Mm-hmm. Neither of those are what we called the Beverly property, though. Is that correct in our previous conversation?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, that's correct. And so you know, Councilor Taylor had brought that up previously. The Beverly properties, staff did look into that, and the Beverly property does not qualify for the Forest Legacy program. But staff did look into that.
One of the things that's interesting to me is I wonder what our alternatives are when I see us at a significantly lower level of collection of SDCs that we're putting off in-city park development until 2014 and 16 and 18. And I'm wondering if there's another opportunity to insert something like that in this ask, and I'll need another round to finish up, I guess.
Okay. Betty?
Thank you. I think I've asked this before and been told no, but is there any way that part of this could be asking for bus service, not MX, but neighborhood bus service in some way?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Taylor, that would be a project that would be put forth by LTD. However, there are certain areas that the federal government doesn't believe that it has or has not traditionally funded. One of those is the operation of transit. That does change over time, as we see there's a huge influx right now for energy efficiency projects, which is really wonderful. So that may change. I know that LTD is putting together, and our delegation certainly knows that the policy on the federal level in relation to the operation of transit and the expansion of those services needs to be addressed by Congress. It can't just be about infrastructure and more buses. It doesn't really help for us to have funding for more buses if we can't provide the service attached to those buses. So yes, that is something that we are discussing with our delegation. Right now there is no funding available for expanding service.
I think it's something we should keep in mind. It's important to the city. It's important to people being able to keep their jobs and look for jobs and all sorts of things. I think that in the past, at least, we haven't had a lot of council involvement until the end of this process. And I wonder if we could emphasize asking people to give suggestions before staff has finalized the
We did that this year, I think.
list. Well, a little bit, but I think we need to really focus on letting people know the time during which they could make suggestions.
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Taylor, yes. And that process starts early on in the year, and as you know, we had a meeting late summer where we began to discuss the proposed projects. That's the time to bring forth any ideas, not just elected officials, but staff or anyone, something that you've heard from the community to bring forth to see whether or not we can match that up to one of those 12 funding mechanisms. But absolutely, project requests can come from anywhere.
But elected officials should really be made aware that you can't wait until you see a list like this and then say, why don't we do this? That now maybe is the time for the following year.
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Taylor, absolutely, and something just to keep in mind is that it's an ongoing process. It's not a one-time thing. So, if you have something in mind, feel free to discuss it with me now, because right now we are preparing for the fiscal year 2012 appropriations as well. Yes.
Thank you.
Checking with Alan.
Alan?
He's gone to sleep.
Probably.
You always got to unmute. You got it.
Yeah, I had it on mute. I don't have any questions at this time.
Okay, thanks for bringing that up, George. All right, Mike, and then we're going to put a motion on the table?
Thank you. Yeah, in keeping with what you've just said to Councilor Taylor there, I think we're going to experience a significant lack of SDCs for the next several years to come based on the evidence of what I've seen. And that's challenging for me. As somebody in North Eugene who doesn't have near the complement of parks that one would have in South Eugene nearby one's home, I hear about that from my constituents on a fairly regular basis. There's a park near our area, our neighborhood, that every time I go to a neighborhood meeting, they want to know when that park is going to be developed. And I had to tell them that on the CIP, that's listed out at 2014 at the moment, and that's if things are as planned, and may not even be that. And there were folks who had assumed that would have been done last year. So, is there a way, we put a lot of money towards the acquisition of park land like we're doing with the Forest Legacy. Is there any sort of venue at all to create an earmark that deals with park land development rather than just acquisition that you're aware of?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, unfortunately, no. That's one of those areas that the federal government believes is a local government responsibility, like pools. However, there are other things that we can do and we have been doing. One thing to keep in mind is that every legislative session, a bill comes out that would preempt local governments from collecting SDCs for parks. So we have to continue to fight that. So that's one thing that we can do, and that's always one of our legislative priorities. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Forest Legacy project, and this kind of touches on something that the mayor, a point the mayor made earlier, is that sometimes it's hard for people to understand that, why are we going after this Forest Legacy money when we really, a park in your neighborhood would be needed. The Forest Legacy program was set up by Congress to fund very specific projects. Unfortunately, the Beverly property and that piece of property would not qualify for that project. It's a very specific color of money.
Right.
And there just aren't other funds that are available, but there are a number of grant funds that are available on the state level for those types of projects, or at least to provide the match, and I would suggest that be something that staff look into.
Well, I had to ask, because you understand we had a little discussion earlier you heard there, and that's why I was willing to vote the other way after what I think was a good discussion, was because it's always a delicate balance between needing that money to develop those parks in our neighborhoods and at the same time needing to make sure we're not killing off jobs at the same time. So lastly, the Metro Waterway study, the $500K is to do what specifically at the Amazon corridor?
That would be for
Generally speaking.
Yeah, and this is something that staff is currently working on because we're not in that phase yet. But basically, it would be and this is just a draft that staff is drawing up because we're not ready to move into that phase yet. But it would be to begin the enhancement projects that were identified in the phase that we're in right now. So it would be to restore natural habitats along the waterways on Amazon Creek, to improve floodplain, riparian, aquatic ecological functions, to protect and improve water resources from erosion, channel complexity, increasing aquatic and riparian vegetation diversity, maintain and improve flood storage capacity, improve quality places for the public to use and for community development along the...
So I'm hearing you say it's ecological and aesthetic in nature, and it's not for the sheer sake of water quality. Do I have that right?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, that's correct. It's to improve recreational facilities along the area, and this particular area for this beginning part of Phase 2 would be from Chambers Street to Bailey Hill Road.
My understanding, too, is that the storm system in West Eugene dumps into that before it reaches its final destination. Do I have that right, too?
Mayor Piercy, Councilor Clark, I don't.
Not all, some of it does, yeah. It collects most of the stormwater in West Eugene.
And it dumps into there after we've spent money to clean it up. So again, we're doing that for the aesthetic and the
Metro
environmental values rather than the water quality values, right?
No, the Amazon Creek enhancements are a mix of all three. It's habitat improvements, water quality improvements, and recreation access.
When it flows through Junction City, do they add anything to the mix?
I don't know that.
Is there anything that drains out of Junction City into that body of water?
I don't think it goes to Junction City. It doesn't go to...
Okay.
It goes to the reservoir.
Okay. Thank you very much. Is it ready? Should I put the motion on
I
the
just
table?
want to make a comment, and then I'll let you put the motion on. I just want to make the comment that each of us have ward and ward interests that we represent around this table, but we all have the interests of the whole community, and we have a commitment to having all of these things, including parks. I forget how much, our goal is that we will have parks within...
Half a mile.
Half a mile of every major metro neighborhood area. So this is something that we, when we talk about these things, we work on in thinking about the whole city. Some places are easier than others to find space and place for those, but it is the goal of this. I just feel it's really important to say to the community, it is the goal of this council to ensure we have good parks and good services everywhere in our community, and that no part of the community has precedent over any other part of the community. And in terms of the Amazon, I think it's in our conversation recently about West Eugene, we pointed out that we think if we can make the Amazon into a treasure instead of a place to dump shopping carts, that it will have a lot of economic advantage for our city and for all the folks who live around it, and can cause new and vibrancy to those areas. So I definitely see cleaning up our waterway and making it all work and function better in the economic interest of our community. I think it's huge in that respect.
I was just going to add on to that the Metro Waterway study isn't about just Amazon Creek and Cedar Creek. So we've been in this process for a long enough time that it's starting to feel like it's just those two areas. But what happened was the whole region needed to look at all the different water bodies, all the water quality, all the enhancements, and those two areas were chosen as the priority project planning areas. So Amazon and Cedar Creek were the first to go. There's still a need to study the Willamette River as it goes through both communities. There's a number of other water bodies, but the Amazon was identified as the top priority because it touched so many parts of Eugene.
Now, you want to put the measure on?
Thank you, Mayor. I move to adopt the 2010 Federal Priority Project List recommendations.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor, please indicate. 6 in favor. Alan?
Aye.
Okay,
Yes.
7 in favor and none in opposition. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Brenda, and that ends our business today. Thank you very much.
2 weeks from today.
The 27th. And just as a heads up,